Good evening. Thank you for coming tonight for the second session of our second part of this three-part series on apologetics. Um, Continuing our discussion of logic, and we're going to take that um, to the next level, I hope. But before we begin, I'd like to start with some prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for this opportunity for us to join together as Christian brothers and sisters and to learn more about what you would have us to do, how you would have us to act and to treat others as we encounter false beliefs, lies, as we face the enemy in the world. Lord, I just, especially in our recent times as we've been dealing with things in the news about conflicts that involve those who choose to follow you, I just pray, Lord, that we would learn how to defend our beliefs and to stand up for you and to promote truth and justice in the American way as we go out into the world and be faithful followers of you. I just pray for your Spirit to be with us tonight and guide all of our thoughts and actions as we go. Pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, again, I want to remind everybody that the purpose of this whole series is to help equip Christians, help us to engage with truth seekers in the world with the ultimate goal of sharing the gospel of Christ. That is the purpose of why we do this. Not to win an argument, not to defeat the enemy in any way. It is to win souls for Christ. And so that's what we're doing this for. Now, just a quick review. In part one, we talked about some arguments that we might face. How do we know God exists? Don't all faiths lead to God? And so forth. That video is available online on YouTube if you wish to go see it. In the first session of the second part, we talked about conditions of intelligibility and began looking at logic, especially as it related to fallacies and all the fallacies. And we're going to actually put those to use tonight, and that's our goal tonight. And then the next part, we continued looking at logic and actually looked at how logical arguments are structured and then where there might be flaws in someone's thinking from a logical perspective. I'm going to run through that again real fast just to remind everybody of that, because I know it's sort of a deep topic, and so I just want to run through it again real fast. So we call this formal deductive logic. Just as a quick reminder, there's inductive and deductive. And deductive logic are things that we can know for certain. Once the argument is complete, we know for certain whether or not something is true. Inductive, we can garner some evidence and get some backing for it, but we can't know for certain through an inductive argument. But we can through a deductive argument. And so we talked about a valid deductive argument, and if you all remember from last time, I threw up letters P's, Q's, and R's, which really is used a lot by those who study logic to construct the arguments, because all logical arguments follow certain patterns. Now, we only looked at a few. There are a lot of different patterns that arguments can follow. We just looked at the most common ones that people could learn. They're fairly easy to learn and have very easy fallacies associated with them that happen a lot. And so that's why we looked at these. These are probably the most common. So a valid deductive argument here, if it's raining here, it's wet here, we call the first part of that sentence P and the second part Q. This is a premise for an argument. Remember, the premise of an argument are those statements that come before the conclusion and they lead to the conclusion. And the conclusion being the part that comes after the therefore, or it is. So here, it is raining here. We assert that to be true, and then we conclude, well, then it's wet here. And we argued that this was a valid argument, and later on we actually showed you what kind of argument this was. And then we talked about categorical logic, which is, all or some things are in a group, and we can show something else is also in that group. Therefore, a property gets transferred because of that membership in these groups. So all dogs are mammals. Well, and we know all mammals breathe air. Therefore, all dogs must breathe air. Okay, so because of that membership in the category, that gets this is called the transitive property. For those that remember their math, this is true in mathematics as well. And then we talked about one thing that you can do then when you hear someone's argument and you're not really sure whether there's something about it. If you have opportunity and you can write it down, or if you can think about it in your head, it's called refutation by logical analogy. And that is, figure out what the parts are in their argument and replace them with something a little simpler. So in this case, we started with the original argument, some men are cowards. All daredevils are men. Then we concluded some daredevils are cowards. And we know something about that isn't right. I mean, it might be very obvious to you that it's not right. But by way of an example, let's replace the pieces. And instead of some men, we'll say some mammals are cats. And then we'll say all dogs are mammals. Well, then some dogs are cats. It's the same argument. It's the same structure as the other one. And we can clearly tell that's not true. So therefore, the original one is not true. And it can't be because they have the same form. And so anything that we can show that has the same form as an argument someone's using and it's false, their argument is false. And that is an easy way of refuting someone's argument. Now I'm going to talk about what I mean when I say refuting someone's argument, because we don't want to just say, you're wrong! We want to be able to do it lovingly. I don't know if y'all saw the Chick-fil-A thing on the news today. They had it was on Fox News. I got my hair cut today and they had it on. So I got to hear about this one young lady at a Chick-fil-A. I have no idea where it was, but apparently the video went viral. She was at the window and this young man came up to the window and recorded the entire thing and confronted her, saying that the Chick-fil-A was a hateful organization and he thought everything that they did was wrong. She should be ashamed of herself, yada, yada. I mean, it was quite disrespectful. She remained calm the entire time. Never batted an eye, treated him with respect the entire time. Very, very well handled in face of it wasn't too aggressive, but it certainly wasn't very polite. And she did not reciprocate. And it was absolutely wonderful to see, because it went viral not because he was right, but because it showed how ignorant he was in his attack. And she did not respond to it in kind. So it was very, very nice. And he has since apologized for his actions. So then we started talking about propositional logic. Okay, propositional logic is logic built on propositions. A proposition is just something we're going to assert. So we started with disjunctive syllogisms and talking about those, where we have one of two things are true, and then we tell you that one of them is not. So we'll assert not P. If P is not the one, then Q must be the one. Okay? And so any argument that's like that is disjunctive syllogism. These are awfully handy. Either he's at work or he's at home. He's not working, well, then he's at home. Okay. It's a very simple argument. Then we went on to the modus ponens. If P, then Q, we'll assert P. And if P is true, then Q must be true. So if we assert P, then Q is true. Okay, so If it's raining, then it is wet. It is raining, well, then it's wet. Okay. So as you can see, the example we started with was a modus ponens. And then the only reason why I'm spending any time explaining these is because it's the errors that we're interested in. We want to know what a valid argument looks like, because oftentimes someone will make a statement that we say, well, that can't be true. Well, what about it is not true? If you can point out what is not true or start picking at what's not true, then we can start helping them understand why their thinking is flawed. And the third one was modus tollens. If P then Q, not Q. Well, then not P. Because the only way Q couldn't happen is P couldn't happen. Because we're told that when P happens, Q will happen. Q did not happen, so then P could not have happened. No, every time P happens, Q will happen. And Q didn't happen, so we know for certain that P did not happen either. So if it's raining here, then it's wet. It's not wet here, then it can't be raining here. Okay? Now I know that's not entirely true, but I think y'all get the point. Okay. Any questions about the structures of these arguments? Now they are in your handout. Just so you know, in your handout on the last page is a logic cheat sheet, because we're going to make reference to this when we talk about the examples. So at the very bottom are the logical pieces that I'm talking about here. And the fallacies and everything that we talked about in 2b and 2a are up above that. Okay, so one of the errors that happens, thinking of the modus ponens, where we assert the antecedent, which is valid, it is invalid to assert the consequent. And think of antecedent and consequent. Antecedent is the first part, consequent is the second. So if P then Q is our well-known if statement, we can't say Q is true, therefore P is true, because that is not a valid argument. Q can be true at other times. It's only immediately after P is true, I am certain that Q is true. I have no idea what happens if P is not true. Q can be anything. So I can't say Q is true, therefore P is true. Q can be true regardless of P. It's just, if P is true, Q must be true. Okay? If P is false, Q could be true or false. And that's the problem. So we can't say Q is true, therefore P is true. That is called affirming the consequent. That is an error. So the example helps us to see this in words. If it's raining here, then it is wet. I'll then say, well, it's wet here. Could you then conclude it's raining here? No, because it could have just stopped raining, and therefore it's wet. Or I could have used a hose and hosed everything down. All I know is, if it were raining, I know it's wet here. But if it's not raining, there could be any number of ways I can get the ground wet. Okay. Hopefully that example helps make that more clear. But the important thing is that using the P's and Q's, that gives us our model. If we can hold the model, then we can replace it with anything. So when someone says something, you go, wait. They're asserting the second part and trying to make the first part true, and that you can't do that. It's not valid. And that would be the more important way of remembering. I don't care if you remember, if P then Q. So the next one is denying the antecedent. This is the opposite or the error for the modus tollens. Denying the antecedent. If P then Q, we'll then say not P. Okay, going back to what I said before, just because P is not true, I have no idea what's going on with Q. The first statement doesn't tell me. The first statement only tells me what happens to Q when P is true. And so if I say not P, I can't conclude anything about Q. And if someone does, it's an error. So if it's raining here, then it's wet. It's not raining here, therefore it's not wet is invalid. You can't do that. The next part here is just the false premise. That is, we have an argument that we have not asserted whether it's valid or not. It's just an argument that has a false premise. And we got to watch out for this. Because in this case, this example that I have here is actually a valid argument. The problem is, it's not sound. And if you remember about valid and soundness, a valid argument is one where if the premises are true, they will lead to the conclusion. Okay, that is a valid argument. So that way, if I could just figure out that the premises are true, I'll know that the conclusion must be true then. And that's what happens with a valid argument. A sound argument is one where the premises are true, and it's a valid argument. So that way, then I know a sound argument has a true conclusion, because the premises are true and the conclusion leads directly from them. This is a valid argument. It follows the structure of an argument the way it's supposed to. It is valid. If the premises were true, it would lead to the conclusion. The problem is, one of the premises is not true. So, an example, it is raining here, then the Braves will win the pennant. It is not wet here. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to correct this. It's not wet here. It should say the Braves do not win the pennant. Therefore, it is not raining. Okay. Last year the Braves, they didn't win the pennant, did they? I don't remember. So if they did, then we'll pick a different team to put into the team that didn't win the pennant. Any one of the 20 some odd teams that didn't win the pennant, stick them in there. The first statement is not valid. It's not true. It doesn't even make any sense. But just because it doesn't make any sense doesn't mean anything, because it's not about whether the argument actually makes sense to be valid. Validness is only, does it follow the form, if P, then Q, not Q, then not P. This does. It is a valid formed argument. Just, it's completely bonkers. So it has a false premise, and therefore it is not sound. I hope that makes sense. And the last one is the enthymemes, where there's an unstated premise. So in this case, it's sort of small to read. Dinosaurs clearly did not live at the same time as people. After all, we don't find any fossils in the same rock layers. Well, there's something missing in their statement. And this is not an uncommon statement. This is a fairly common one when it comes to trying to support evolution. The problem is there's an unstated premise in here. And that is, we probably should say, if we want to do this properly, if dinosaur fossils were found in the same rock layers as human fossils, then they lived at the same time. Now you can continue on with the argument, dinosaur fossils are not found in the same rock layers, therefore they did not live at the same time. Problem is, this is an invalid argument, because it's denying the antecedent, and you can't do that. So there might be another way to structure the premise. The way I've structured it here, it happens to be an invalid argument. There might be a way to structure it so it's actually valid and get your premise in there. So I don't want someone to think I've created a straw man to knock down an evolutionary thought. I just, in this particular example, it's a denying the antecedent. Okay. Then I talked about the necessity of consistency. You know, when we talked at the very beginning about the conditions of intelligibility, one of the things was you needed to be consistent. And one of the laws of logic is the law of non-contradiction, that you can't have P and not P to both be true at the same time. So what we did was actually use logic to show that if P and not P were true at the same time, it would lead to an absurd result. So the example here, if P and not, well, I should say P and not P. It shouldn't say if P and not P. It's just P and not P. They're both true. We'll say they're both true. And then from that piece of knowledge, we can then use a logical argument that would be a disjunctive syllogism, P or Q. And remember, if P or Q, then all I can do is, if one of them is false, the other one's got to be true, right? So P or Q, I'll say not P. Right? Now remember, not P is true. So Q has to be true. Right? Not P is a true statement. Right? Because remember, up at the top we said P and not P. Both of those are true. So in our disjunctive syllogism, P or Q, we can assert not P. Up at the top, that was one of the things we assumed to be true. So not P was true. If not P, then Q in the disjunctive syllogism is the one that's true between P and Q. The confusing part here is that we are using P in both forms in this argument, because both P and not P are true. But it's irrelevant in a P or Q. It doesn't matter whether P is true or Q is true. They could both be true, right? All we know is if we can show one of them is false, then the other one is true. So since not P is a true statement, Q is by definition true from a disjunctive syllogism. Therefore, Q is true. That means I can stick anything I want in Q. Pigs fly, unicorns exist, doesn't matter. Whatever I do, if I have a contradiction in my logical system, then I can assert anything to be true. And it is by definition true. And clearly, that is absurd. That is why the law of non-contradiction holds. You don't have anything logical if you allow a contradiction to exist. Therefore, they can't exist. That avoids this problem. And the last thing we talked about were circular reasoning, that if you're going to have a worldview of any kind, some point somewhere you will have to appeal to your ultimate authority to be able to even claim that your ultimate authority is true. You'll have to appeal to that authority. In logic, the ultimate authority is logic itself. In order to prove logic, you need to assume logic. So here's our argument in a logical form to show that it's actually required for logic to exist. That if there was no law of logic, we could not make an argument, but we can make an argument. Therefore, there must be laws of logic. So it is circular, but just because something's circular is not a problem. If a circular argument can actually prove itself, that through its argument it is able to prove that it's true, not that it will make assumptions along the way that then you're sort of forced into this circle. This is a logical argument using the structure of logic to prove that logic is true. Okay? I dare you to try to show that it's false. Because in order to show that it's false, you have to use logic, which is self-refuting. Right? So we have a little problem there. Sorry. Any questions? I know that was quick. Did that in probably 15 minutes. But I want to get to the examples and look at a couple real examples. I went and actually found them. A couple letters to the editor, one NPR interview. And, well, actually, this interview wasn't on NPR, but I heard it on NPR, but I found the interview somewhere else. So I want to talk about applying logic. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail in this part. I'm going to talk about this more in the last part of Apologetics sometime in the fall. But our basic approach, I'm using the Ultimate Proof of Creation by Jason Lisle for a large portion of what I've been talking about in logic and all that. But I'll tell you, in the two books that I've recommended, that book and the book by Greg Koukl called Tactics, they both are coming at this from basically the same approach. They call it totally different things, but it's the same approach, and that's what I'm talking about. So here's how Jason Lisle presents it in his book. In Proverbs 26, verses 4 through 5, it reads, and this is the English Standard Version, which is the version that we use for preaching on Sunday. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. Now, I actually like the New American Standard Version just a little bit better, because it actually says this a little bit different. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will also be like him. Answer a fool as his folly deserves, that he not be wise in his own eyes. Okay, so it seems like it's contradicting itself, doesn't it? Because the first sentence says, in both parts, answer not a fool according to his folly, answer a fool according to his folly. Isn't that a contradiction? But in this case, it's not. If we think about the nuance that the psalmist seems to be getting at here, is at the very beginning when you are talking to a fool, someone who is worldly and doesn't understand how God operates, or at least in any small way that we could possibly do it, that they have fallacious thinking. And the first part is recommending that you not jump into their thinking. So therefore, answer not a fool according to his folly. Don't start siding with them and say, well, okay, let's assume let's go down your road. Oftentimes what will happen is they'll say, prove to me that God exists, but don't use your Bible. And what is a common Christian going to do there? Okay, I'll put my Bible aside. I'll prove to you God exists. That is the first part. That's answering a fool according to his folly. And you're going to become just like him. Because the problem is, you've just laid aside one of your pieces of evidence that proves that God exists. And is in fact God's word to us. Therefore, you are jumping right into their boat. Remember, Christ told us there is no neutral ground. You are either for him or you're against him. And so you cannot try to find the common ground. You can't find the neutral ground between you and your opponent by giving up what it is that makes your argument true. If you give up what makes your argument true, you are now false. And you're on their side. You are now a fool just like they are. That's the verse 4. But the verse 5 says, answer the folly as he deserves, lest they not be wise in their own eyes. So we want to approach a fool, someone who is confused about the truth. so that they can be made so it can be made clear to them what is wrong with their thinking. Not so that we can join them on their side, but that we can actually help them clarify their thinking so that they can then see more clearly what the truth is and can actually understand the truth. So that's our goal. So one of the ways the way Jason Lyle describes this in his book is to take the fool down their path. Okay, for the sake of argument, let's assume you are correct. Let's see where it goes. Okay, that's the approach that Jason Lyle describes in his book. Greg Kokel, in his book, calls it the Columbo approach. Start asking a bunch of questions. And if y'all, are you familiar with Columbo? Okay. I'm sure you are. What? Socrates? Okay. Yeah. Very similar. The beauty of Columbo was he came across as almost a bumbling idiot. That was his approach. He didn't want you to think he was onto anything. It just, I'm a little confused. Can you clarify something for me? And he would do that over and over again. And he would walk away, and you'd think you'd satisfy, and he'd come back. Now, I think I'm more confused now than I was before, because I remember you saying, and he would come back with some more questions. And that was the beauty of his approach. He would pick at you with these questions that seemed totally irrelevant until he came all the way around and smacked you right upside the head with all of the things that you said that don't line up. But he never did it in such a way that you felt like he attacked you. He always did it in a way where you realized you were caught and it was time to give up. That was the Columbo approach. That is the beauty of the Columbo approach. It's so disarming. It's so gentle. I don't want to beat up my opponent. I want my opponent to think about it. I want them to realize, oh gosh, that doesn't make any sense at all. I see quite often around the abortion debate, people who support abortion, when you start talking about what that means, a Christian standpoint would be that's killing a baby, because God tells us in his word that a baby is knitted together in their mother's wombs by God. And therefore we consider it precious from the moment that it's conceived. People will try to disregard that and say, well, it's not really a person yet. And so the question then becomes, why are they a person outside of the womb when 5 seconds before that they weren't? And they were inside the womb. And you can lead someone down the path of realizing, there's really not much difference. And therefore, we can get them into this state of dissonance where they don't really like the position they're in anymore, because it's not a very good one, because now they're killing a human being, something that they wouldn't advocate in any other way except in this one case. They would. And so if we can get them thinking about that without actually saying, you are killing someone. So let's look at some examples. Right, so someone coming in and killing your pregnant wife, yes. Should that be one murder or two? And, a number of states have said that's 2. Right. And honestly, most people get in some very uncomfortable positions when they have to start thinking like that, because they don't want to think of the unborn child as an actual human being, because it's a lot easier to kill something that's just a clump of cells than it is to actually kill a human being. And so if we can get them thinking about that, we don't have to beat them over the head with it. All we've got to do is get them thinking about it. They won't like the position they're in. they will change. It'll take time, but they will change. So let's look at an example. The first example, and these are in your handout, because I have them up on the screen, but they're in the handout so that way you can actually read them. This first one comes right out of Greg Koukl's book, and it's a good example, I think, of a problem that many of us are faced with. You're hosting a dinner party at your home with some friends from church, and you're talking about all kinds of spiritual things, and all of a sudden your 15-year-old son shocks you. Very belligerently says he doesn't believe God exists anymore. It's simply not rational. There's no proof. But you had no idea this was coming. And this is one of the examples of why I actually wanted to do this whole series, is because stuff like this comes up where people say things like that that are awfully bold claims. There is no proof. Okay, wow, that's really? There's no proof? Because you'd have to look at a lot of things to be able to show there is no proof. So it's very difficult. But to me, I have this example in here only to begin the conversation of that this is actually about asking questions and trying to lead into conversations. Because in this particular situation, you're sitting amongst a group where you just had your child say this. Do you ignore it, or do you try to do something about it? Do you stand up and say, I can't believe you just said that. You're my son. I've been taking you to church for years. I don't think that would be a very effective approach. And I don't think many people would think that was. Now, I'm not saying we wouldn't use it, even if we didn't think it was effective, because sometimes we do things even though we know that's not the best way to do it. So unfortunately, that is true. But Greg Koukl in his book has a number of examples. I highly recommend this book. Probably more so than Jason Lyle's book. I mean, if you were going to get one of the two, I would probably recommend Greg Koukl's book over Jason Lyle. Jason Lyle really gets into the nitty-gritty of logic and arguments and stuff like that, which is, I think, really helpful to get you grounded in it. Greg Koukl spends most of his time talking about how you can actually have the conversation. Regardless of whether you know all this other stuff, how can you have this conversation? And we're going to talk about that some more on the next one, because we are going to talk about having the conversation about abortion, having the conversation about homosexual marriage. Good, non-confrontational kind of conversation is what we want to talk about. So here's one here. Now, Greg Koukl suggests, and I'm just going to read what he says. This is what he says in his book. He suggests approaching your child this way. What do you mean by God? That is, what kind of God are you rejecting? What specifically is irrational about believing in God? Can you see the non-confrontation here? He's not confronting the child with how the child's wrong. It's, okay, you made some claims in what you just said. I'd like to understand it a little more. What is it that you mean? When you say there is no God, what does that mean? Because we assume when someone says that I believe in God, we assume, oh, you mean, the big guy upstairs. Well, that might not be what they mean. They might mean, all of us in the, spiritual realm of the world, we're all gods. So when they say, I believe in God or I don't believe in God, we got to find out, what? Can I ask you a question? And I want to make sure we're on the same playing field here. And you can do it in a very non-confrontational way. Since you're concerned about proof for God's existence, what kind of evidence would be convincing? Which would be a really good question to ask somebody who says, there's no proof. What would it take to prove it to you? And just see what they think. Right. It really is. It's about getting them to think about what they're saying. In every instance that we're going to look at, it's about getting them to think about what they've said, because we see there's a flaw. And we don't want to just point it out, because nobody likes to have something pointed out. I mean, I know I don't. if someone sees something wrong with me, I just assume they not come up to me and say, you know what, you're a jerk because you said such and such and that was not right, as opposed to, maybe trying to present it in a different fashion about, have you ever thought about how it would feel to be told such and such? And then you're like, oh gosh, I'm a jerk. All of a sudden, you would acknowledge that you're a jerk for doing it. But if someone were to come up to you and tell you were a jerk for doing it, you'd be like, get out of my face. And you would totally disregard what they had to say. But if they presented it in such a way that it caused you to start thinking about what you did, putting it back on you or putting it back on them, now all of a sudden it gets them, I call it the state of dissonance, that they wanted to be here and you're causing them to think about how their position isn't here, it's actually over here, and they don't like that. They want to be where they were, and you just move them, and now they have to figure out what to do about it. And if they want to be intellectually honest with themselves, they're going to have to move once they realize they're in this state. And that's what we want. We want this kid to be thinking about this. Oh, well, I give this list of proofs that I think would be convincing, and then we start picking them off. Now all of a sudden this kid's like, maybe there is proof. And state of dissonance. They got to move. They start moving closer to the truth. And that's what we wanted. Any questions? Because now we're going to actually get into the examples. What? No questions in the audience. Okay. Example 2. This was an interview. I got this interview from Marketplace. I heard a very similar interview on NPR. That's what caused me to look for this, because Cyndi Lauper is on this big kick about homeless gays and lesbians, youth. Now, not saying that there's anything wrong with actually caring about homeless youth. It has nothing to do with that. It's the claims that are being made that I'm interested in, because there's some interesting claims here. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to look at this interview between Cyndi Lauper and I don't even know who Hobson is. There's an interview with Hobson who asked her some questions. I'd like you to, using the little logic cheat sheet on the back, I'd like you to see if you can identify at least one fallacy or error in what she says. Lesbian, gay, bi, and transgender. Even if you can't identify exactly what the fallacy is there anything in there that you see that you think something doesn't seem right about this? Okay. Okay. Seems pretty strong, doesn't it? Do you know what kind of fallacy that is? Not that it's going to matter in the real world. I mean, again, in the real world, you're going to hear something like that, and you're not going to go, that's a question-begging epithet. But that's what that is. A question-begging epithet is something that you are using charged language to try to make your argument. And there's definitely some charged language in this, right? Because it's not even the only time she uses the word thrown out. And nobody wants to be thrown out, right? Not only that, she says in that last sentence, thrown out of every place just because they're gay or transgendered. Exactly. They got to be somewhere, so clearly that's not even a true statement. That is false. Yep. And there's another one. I have noted fallacy of faulty appeal in here as well. Right. Yep. The last one, that's like throwing your child out because he has brown hair or she has brown hair. Anytime you hear a that's like, you can go right to the false analogy and see whether they're making an analogy that is actually accurate. So they are children in both cases. Gay, lesbian are children. They're talking about your children. But what they're concluding here, first off, we don't even know why the LGBT kids are being thrown out, if they are being thrown out. We know that there are some homeless kids out there, and there may be a large majority of them that are LGBT. I don't know why they're out there, but it certainly isn't like throwing your own child out because they had brown hair. It's nothing like that at all.
It's a moral stance rather than physical.
Right. So that's what I want us to do. Now, one of the things that I would recommend, in order to get good at anything, what do you need to do? Practice, right? You learned how to ride a bike because you got on your bike umpteen million times, and you fell off. I don't know. Sometimes people get on a bike and can ride it instantly, but most people can't. Most people fall off their bike at some point when they're trying to learn how to ride. You've got training wheels on there that help balance you. But you practice. My recommendation is that you do things like this. That's why I made this little cheat sheet, because I wanted you to be able to have a reminder of these different kind of fallacies, and to be watching when you read the newspaper. And obviously not every day and all the time. I don't mean that, but that regularly say, you know what, I need to practice this. If I want to get good at being able to identify what's wrong with someone's statements, because what we want to then be able to do is say, okay, I see some charged language here. Now what do I do? She just made some statements here that are really, wow, whoa. I want to try to disarm this. I want to try to get at, okay, really, like you said, they can't have been thrown out of every place. So, are you really serious about that? I mean, so they don't live anywhere? I mean, why are we worried about them then? Because they don't even exist anymore. So clearly that's not true. And so that gives us our opening now. We've got our opening. What we want to learn how to do is how to deal with that opening. But this whole second part here is all about identifying this opening. And here we've got a number of places where we can just start picking at it, start doing the Columbo thing, and start saying, I'm a little confused here. And I'm hoping that you can help clarify this for me. Because you say they were thrown out. I mean, really, when you say thrown out, what do you mean by thrown out? Do you mean someone actually picked them up and threw them out? Or they didn't do anything that caused this? All 40% of them? Or might there be other factors involved that you're not elucidating?
And would it be too defensive to say 40%? Where did you get it from?
I don't think it's too defensive. I mean, it could be if you come across, where's your data come from? But if you say, wow, that's a big number. I mean, do you have data to back that up? I mean, could you show me where that is? I'd like to read that. Right. I had a conversation with people who were opposing the vote on traditional marriage back in election time. They set up a table on campus promoting same-sex marriage, and I went and had a conversation with them. And they started spouting facts at me, and I said, I sure would like to read that article. And I gave them my email address, and they never sent me the article. Probably because there is no actual research that backs up the claim, and so they had nothing to give me. I would be glad to look at some good evidence. If you got it, I'm curious. So if this kind of claim, up to 40%, wow. I mean, I would like to see the articles. I want to understand what is in that 40%. Would you be willing to hunt that down for me and let me know what it is? It's a good way to get in. You're not even saying there's anything wrong with the claim. Because ultimately, it might actually be 40% of the homeless youth are lesbian, gay, bi, and transgender. I don't care in this regard. For the argument's sake, I don't care whether that's true or not. I care about the kids that are homeless and hate to see that, and I don't want any of them thrown out. But we've got some claims going on here we need to deal with. Let's look at the next example. This came out of the off of Answers in Genesis website. The link is down here. It is a long letter that was written to Answers in Genesis. This is a real letter from somebody. It's a longer letter. Answers in Genesis, I think Jason Lyle's the one that responded to this letter. They actually put their response on their website, so you can actually go read the whole thing, see all the things that they say about it, but read this little snippet. Right, so you picked up on one thing that we could immediately start asking about, though, right? First off, is that last statement even true? So it says, I mean, I know there's an inflammatory part to this. Why don't you just support the Amish way of life and reject modern technology? Is that true? Right? Why is that not true? What do they not reject? They do use modern technology. Right? They are allowed to drive a vehicle. They have refrigeration. Wow, I did not know that. That's interesting. So yeah. Yeah. Now, granted, they do attempt to reject most modern technology, but this doesn't say that. This says they reject modern technology. That you are so far in the dark ages that you want to reject everything. Now, the other part here is, what in the world does that have to do with the rest of this letter? And this is only the beginning of the letter. There's even more after this. But so what in the world does this have to do with anything else that this person is claiming? Would certainly be an area of interest. Anything else in here that... Oh, there's a P and not P in here? Okay, where is that? Okay. Yeah. All right, so no one can know the true nature of God, and yet he proceeds to tell us that God did something, so clearly this person knows. Very interesting. I did not catch that one. Very interesting. So there are a number of them in here. I don't want to spend the whole time because I actually want to try to get through a couple more, and we only have a few more minutes. I'd like to try to end this at an hour. I would point out, I'm sure when you read part of this, you might have felt the scathing attack towards the organization. I believe that your strict views of creationism are archaic, ignorant. So these are very targeted. They're aimed right at answers in Genesis. That's what they're trying to do. These people are ignorant, archaic. That's an ad hominem. They're not. Yeah. Whew, wow. Yeah. That would be the. Yeah. And so one thing you might do is, wow, that is a strong statement. Would you be willing to explain to me the connection there, how these two are actually related? Yeah. How is the Christian organization related to the Taliban? Because in order for you to be able to have a intelligent conversation with them, you actually need to understand what this connection is. Why do you think these two are connected? And then if you can get them to start thinking about what the Taliban is like and what this Christian organization are like, and the fact that the Taliban kills people and blows themselves up, and this Christian organization does not, then they are in this state of dissonance again. These two things don't jive. That is a statement I can't use anymore. We've taken down one of their pillars that they're standing on. And we want to do that to all of their pillars. So that ultimately then they end up standing on God's truth instead of their own.
So if they're thinking for themselves, that you guide their thinking.
Yes. Yes, we want to guide their thinking. Because what we're trying to do is lead them. I don't want to say lead the horse to water, because I don't want to imply that they're horses, but we are leading them to water. Leading them to the truth. God tells us that until you know him, you are blind. And we need to recognize these people are blind. They can't see the truth. And we can't look at them and say, gosh, you're a fool. What are you, an idiot? We don't want to do that because, yes, they are. Because there's a total blinder on them. And until God opens their eyes, they won't see the truth. So we need to help to open that up. And so if we come at them treating them as if they are stupid when they're not, they are blind, and we want to help them see. And so that's what we're doing. So I'm going to skip example 4. It's sort of a weak example. After I got it, I didn't really like it. I will point out, if you read the last sentence, protecting our environment attracts, next to last sentence, protecting our environment attracts new business, contrary to the myth that we must choose between a healthy ecosystem and good jobs. I want to point that sentence out because that's something we talked about, right? They said there's a myth that you have to choose between one or this other thing, but that's a myth because you don't have to choose between these two. You can have them both the same. That's a bifurcation, right? A bifurcation is that you're setting up that there's only two choices, when in fact there's a third. And this person actually in their argument, I think there's some fallacious parts to this, but they actually point out a bifurcation. And I thought, oh, how cool is that? The last example that I have is another one where someone actually wrote in their letter to the editor how someone's argument was fallacious. I think it's pretty cool. I mean, I couldn't find the original article though. What? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Let's go to example 5. Again, this is a letter to the editor in the Asheville Citizen-Times, obviously about Belshare. Anything jumping out at you? What do y'all see? So-called street preachers?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of judgmental on this reverend's part.
Okay. Yeah, this is a reverend
That is,
that's writing this letter, and he calls them so-called street preachers. Okay?
yeah, so that could be self-proclaimed, and that's what he's saying. How do we know that this is true?
Right.
True man of God.
Right. I labeled that as a no true Scotsman. Right? Who gets the right to say it's a street preacher or a so-called street preacher? Right? And the fact that this letter came from a reverend, which is, I would venture to guess, is why the Citizen Times chose to publish it. Because looking at the genetic fallacy, that the origin of the argument has some validity to it. Yes, there is some validity to where an argument comes from to some extent. It doesn't necessarily make an argument valid. So just because this letter comes from a reverend doesn't mean a hill of beans. And I think there's a number of other things in here as well that you might find. I'm going to skip the next example too. I don't think it's as weak as the fourth one I skipped, but I want to look at the next one because the next one's been in the news, and it's a long one, and you don't need to read the whole thing. Just read the first paragraph and see if you can find anything in the first paragraph.
So you don't know about the argument that he gives all this money to go to political.
Okay,
Does he really do?
so now the claim here is that Chick-fil-A gives this money to influence government leaders and the public to take away gay and lesbian rights. All right? I'm going to read to you from the Biblical Recorder what Dan Cathy said. This is in the Biblical Recorder. He was talking about an organization that their company contributes to. It's called WindShape. That they were fostering some programs, and he said, quote, "That morphed into a marriage program in conjunction with National Marriage Ministries." Kathy added. The writer says, "Some have opposed the company's support of the traditional family." Quote, "Well, guilty as charged," said Kathy when asked about this opposition. Quote, "We are very much supportive of the family, the biblical definition of the family unit. We are a family-owned business, a family-led business. We are married to our first wives. We give God thanks for that," end quote. Now, do you hear anything in there about what he just said that says that they're taking away any rights from gays and lesbians? So what kind of argument is this person making?
But if you're opposed, if you're for marriage, then evidently you're opposed to gay and lesbian.
Well, that's what they want. That's what they're trying to say.
Yeah.
What kind of argument is that? That's a fallacious argument, and it's a particular kind. No. It's called a straw man fallacy. They're setting up something that sounds similar to what we're doing, but in fact is not what we're doing. There is not a Christian on this, well, there's not a Bible-believing evangelical Christian who is desiring to take away any rights from gays and lesbians. They already have a right to marry. They can choose to marry whomever they want, as long as it's a member of the opposite sex, because that's what marriage is. They have that right today. The grassroots organizations that want to pass marriage amendments pass amendments that defend and support that definition of marriage. We do not want to pass a law that denies gays and lesbians the right to marry. It's not a true statement. It is a straw man fallacy to set up this thing that sounds like we're trying to take rights away, when in fact that's not what we're doing. Yes, we are opposed to redefining marriage to be between a man and a woman and a woman, or 6 men or 5 women. We don't want to define marriage that way. That's not the way marriage is defined. And we are upholding the right, as is Kathy here, Dan Cathy, and the organization that Chick-fil-A supports, want to defend the way marriage is traditionally defined. And here is an argument making a straw man fallacy. You hear these things all of the time, especially around gay marriage. It's not that our position is not shown as trying to defend traditional marriage. It's trying to take away rights, when in fact there's nothing of the sort going on. And one of the problems I think that's going on in the Christian church is that many people are starting to buy into this argument. Oh my gosh, we can't take away their rights. They should be able to love one another. No, they can love one another. We're not stopping that. I can love whoever I want. In fact, I'm supposed to love everybody. God defined marriage in the beginning, told us how it works, how it's defined. We have screwed it up ever since. We as the human race have screwed it up ever since. And we are trying to hold to that definition of marriage and not change it. And that's the whole point of it. This goes on. There's a number of other things in here. If you keep reading, they start throwing out the homophobia card, as if standing up for traditional marriage means you're homophobic, which means you're afraid of homosexuals. And why is it that standing up for something that's against gays getting married means that I'm afraid of them, right? Where's the connection? And these are doors that we can now have open for us. So you say I'm homophobic. Can you clarify what homophobic means for me? Because the traditional definition of homophobic means I'm afraid of gays. And actually I'm having a conversation with you and you're gay, so clearly I'm not afraid of you. So maybe I'm confused about the definition or how you're using it. Maybe you can help clarify it for me.
So it sounds like if you're viewed on television, you choose your words wisely. Bottom line.
He is clearly well versed in what to say. He said exactly what he meant to say. I think it was enough to get some more. What surprises me in this particular example, Chick-fil-A has always been this way. They've been this way since the 40s when they were founded.
And what was the organization? Did you say Winston?
Their organization they support is WinShape.
Winshape.
Yeah, WinShape. You can go to winshape.com, WINSHAPE.com, and they support Christian growth and ministry through that foundation. So, but it's interesting that this whole firestorm happens now when Chick-fil-A has been this way for over 60 years now. Okay, did you not know that? They've been supporting this traditional marriage forever. And now all of a sudden it's a big problem. So I'm not really sure what I think it has everything to do with what's going on at the national level and the fact that our whole country is becoming very polarized around this one issue. And maybe rightfully so. I don't know. But Well, to me, I think it's a shining example of how we have wandered very far away from God, and that is probably the most glaring example at this point. It was abortion for a long time, and now homosexuality is just taken front and center to show the world is basically just giving the finger to God and saying, I don't care what you say. We're going to do whatever we want, and I dare you to stop us. So I think it should be a wake-up call, as it seems like it was last Wednesday when 650,000 people went to Chick-fil-A. I was one of them. The last one is just an example. I just wanted to point it out. I just thought it was neat. This was also from the Citizen Times. Someone wrote, equating entitlement with something for nothing by Karl Mumpower is a false premise. How's that? His generalization fails to discern benefits we earn through taxation, yada, yada, yada. I didn't care about that. It was the fact that this person actually wrote a letter to the editor identifying a fallacious argument by its name. I could not find any article that Karl Mumpower wrote that made this claim. I looked for it, but I ran out of time. I'm sure if I tried harder, I might be able to find where he actually made this comparison, but I couldn't find it. So, anyhow. So there's the example for everyone else to see. So, any questions?
It was just open to lots of questions. So consistent. How, when we are confronted with questions, how can we gently, change someone's mind?
Right. And so, from this series, the second part of the Apologetics trilogy, I wanted us to be able to see what is wrong with some of the statements that are being made. Where are the holes? Where's the weaknesses? What are they building their beliefs on? Not so that we can yet start reaching in there and start knocking them all down, but so that we can start thinking about it, because I think we need to start getting really familiar with recognizing these things. Once you start recognizing, you're going to start wanting to actually say something about it and ask questions about it. Like, wow, that's pretty strong. Can you, explain that to me? And then you're going to start feeling more comfortable about it, because you're going to hear these things and see them so much when you read articles, when you watch the news. I'm telling you, every time I watch the news now, there is something that is said that to me is a fallacious argument. And I am not I don't have a degree in logic. I didn't study logic for a long period of time. I just studied it a little bit here and there. But I start recognizing that person made a claim. I need some evidence. And I would be asking for it. Last week, I was out at dinner with a couple coworkers, one of whom was homosexual, and they were talking about, what were they talking about? Something about, I think it had to do with homosexuals, and how their lifestyle doesn't harm anyone. And so I interjected and I said, but what if it does? What if it does harm somebody? Because your claim is it doesn't. But what if it does? I just wanted them to think about it. I wasn't in the position at the time to really try to tear that down. I want to start, as one of the authors I've read states it, I want to put a pebble in their shoe and make them walk with it for a while. See if it bothers them. And it might be so small that it bothers them for a little bit, but they're able to, push it down low enough that it doesn't bother them anymore. But hopefully by then, I can get another pebble in their shoe. And eventually I can get enough pebbles in that shoe where they're going to feel like they have to take it off. And that's a victory. I got them to take the shoe off. It was the wrong shoe. You need a different shoe on. And so I want them to recognize that. So in part 3, we are going to look at homosexuality and abortion. Because I think those are the two hot button issues that come up over and over again, where you are likely to be faced with someone who supports it. Unfortunately, there are many people that go to this church that support both of these. Maybe not the same person, but there are people in this church that support abortion. There are people in this church that support homosexuality. There are many people who claim to be Christians who believe this. Can you be a Christian and support homosexuality? I would attest yes, because we're all sinners. I am a sinner, and I am certain I have some false beliefs. Right. I have some false beliefs that need to be corrected. So just because someone believes that it's right doesn't mean they're not a Christian, but they do have a belief that needs to be corrected. And as a fellow Christian, we are called to reach out to them and help them to change that belief. It's wrong, and it needs to be corrected. As are, like I said, some of my beliefs. And I would hope that I have Christian brothers and sisters who are willing to say to me, I think your belief is wrong. You know, maybe not in that way, but are willing to challenge me on the beliefs that I have that are wrong, that are doctrinally unsound, and help me see what the Bible says about them so that I can be a stronger Christian, more committed Christian. I don't know yet. We'll announce it in church, put it in the bulletin, but I don't have a date yet. Well, I thank you all for coming. Appreciate it, and I hope that this makes a difference. I know I've heard a couple comments so far from people who have said, I was able to use this, I was able to see such and such, and that's my hope. I want myself to grow, that's why I'm doing it, and I want you all to grow because I love you as a Christian, and I want everyone in this church to take this to heart and to actually try to become better Christians. See you all in the fall.